Hey guys, it's Jalen, and I'm here today with another writing video. Today we've got another video on world building. World building is a topic that I'm so excited to talk about more on this channel. Two of my most viewed videos from last year were the two world building videos that I did, and so that really made me realize that this is a topic that you guys want to see more of, which is great because it's a topic I want to talk more about. I started writing fantasy after a hiatus from the genre a couple of years ago, and the next project that I'm just gearing up to start drafting in the next couple months is fantasy, so I feel like I've been deep in world building over the past year that I've been working on planning this project. So today I wanted to talk about world building details that you haven't considered. Little things that you can think of to spice up your world that I think can add some interesting flair, and I think these are things that are often forgotten or overlooked. The caveat here is the title of this video is 12 world building details you haven't considered. You could be 10 steps ahead of me. You may have thought of all of these. I don't mean to presume. I just thought these were all tiny little details that are either small and so maybe not the first thing you think of, or they're broad concepts that are kind of often so ingrained that we don't think to question them, and we just end up kind of recycling the same ideas. In this video, when I say that certain stuff is really ingrained, I am obviously talking about what's ingrained societally from my perspective, but this is also the same stuff that I see recycled in fantasy over and over. I wouldn't be talking about these things. My own, Western cultural perspective was the same one that I'm seeing recycled in fantasy over and over. That said, learning about the world is one of the best ways to become better at world building. The more you know about different cultures, the better you are at breaking down ideas of what is normal, and the better you get at questioning things that may be ingrained to you to the point that you don't even realize there could be another way. The more you see that diversity of human experience and culture in our own world, the easier it is to break out of those ideas as a world builder in fantasy. It really helps you get past this idea of what is expected, what is normal, and make more informed choices about your world building so that you're really building every detail with intention rather than just going with what feels obvious. One of my favorite resources that I've been enjoying as I've been getting back into world building is the podcast Worldbuilding for Masochists, which I really highly recommend, and full credit to them for this quote, but they always say their mantra is choose, don't presume. And I think it's like such a great golden rule of world building, which is make intentional choices about your world. Don't just presume that this is how things are and always will be. My other little thing before I get into the details that you can talk about, if you have magic, think about how it can weave into all of these things. These are little details that it's fun to think about, but it's also fun to think about how they might intersect with the more fantastical elements of your world, whatever those might be. Yeah, so these are all just little things that I think aren't obvious. Like when we start world building, we think about the obvious stuff, like we think about the government and we think about the magic system and we think about the geography. There are also some littler things that I think are fascinating and can give really interesting insight into your world and also make it feel more lived in and real, because these are little things that are real to a culture in real life. And so having those little details, I think, really helps make a world feel so much realer. First one that I think you can think of is lexical gaps. So a lexical gap is when there is not a word for something in a given language, even though grammatically that word should be possible to exist in the language. But in a fantasy context, they can also show you what concepts are simply not relevant to a culture. I think the most famous one I can think of from a fantasy context, like a conlang, if I'm remembering correctly, is that in A Song of Ice and Fire, or actually, I don't know if this was created just for the show or if this detail was in the books. In Dothraki, there's no word for thank you. Remember that scene from the pilot where Daenerys asks, like, how do I say thank you in Dothraki? And then I think Jorah's like, there isn't a word for thank you. And it shows, like, this isn't a culture that thanks. This is a culture that just takes things. I think especially if you have multiple different cultures, or if you're doing any conlang work, thinking of the words that they don't have and how that could be significant or reveal something about the culture is really fun. The next one, what do they make alcohol out of? The vast majority of cultures have some form of alcohol or substance that they use to get drunk or high off of. But I feel like I don't see very often in fantasy, at least not as often as would make sense for how prevalent substance use is across like human society. It's usually just like ale, mead, but like what are they making alcohol out of based on what's in the world? Especially if you're doing any inventive flora fauna work and you have like plants that don't exist in our world. Are people making alcohol out of that, or are they making drugs out of that? Beyond that, what are kind of the traditions or beliefs or practices around like alcohol or substance use in this culture. Number 3, this is kind of a niche one, but it just came up because of a detail that I was working with in my own world building. What are the relationship structures that your society is built around? You know, in Western culture, society is really built around the nuclear family. Romantic relationships and marriage is kind of framed as the most important relationship. Everything branches off from there, and as well as probably, you know, parenthood, like having children. That doesn't have to be the foundational relationship structure of your society. It could be something completely different. Like, the nuclear family is not the only way. Obviously, there are other cultures that are more intergenerational households. I don't just mean that. I just mean there can be other relationship structures that are the most important in your society. So I have a culture in the world that I'm building where the foundational relationship that all of society is structured around is friendship rather than marriage or family. So you don't raise your children with your spouse, you raise your children with your friends. And you don't get married to a romantic partner. They don't call it marriage, but your life partners is your friend groups. And society is especially built around friend groups of women. They form these groups of like 10 to 12 friends, and you become like magically sealed together. That's your family. That's who you raise your children with. You can have romantic and sexual partnerships inside that circle or outside of it, but they're not the most important relationships in your life. The most important people and who you're going to raise your kids with, if you have kids, your girlies, right? And men also in that society, they just partner up in pairs. That's their life partner, is their bestie. It's like a nomadic clan structure, so it's kind of expected that the men will have more mobility and kind of move around more between clans, whereas these groups of women are kind of the foundational structures of these clans. That's the relationship structure that society is built around. It's not built around family units. It's built around friendships units, which kind of in this world are the family. That's stuff that I think is really fun to play with and play around with the relationship structures that are foundational to your society. Number 4 is sports and games. I don't think we talk enough about leisure in fantasy. I think sometimes it's easy to get more caught up on serious topics, but people like to have fun. Are there games that kids play? Are there sporting events? I have a culture in my fantasy world that they love a sporting event. They love to just all gather for a big sporting event. They would love the Olympics, nomadic culture, but are built around, you know, every certain amount of time we gather and we do games. I have another culture in my world where originally it was supposed to be barter economy, and then my brother, who has a degree in economics, shout out to Jake, he was like, yeah, that's not going to make sense. You don't understand how barter economies work. It doesn't make sense in this context. And I was like, thank you for your knowledge. In this society, there are certain games that are used as part of bartering. People can kind of put up what they're betting, items that they're betting with, and then you play this little game, and the winner gets the object. Part of the bartering culture is this little game. Number 5, this is one that I think it's more likely that people think of a lot when they're world building. It's a more common world building question, but I just don't think we do enough cool stuff with it, and it's how do they bury their dead? Burial practices, rituals, that stuff can be really, really interesting, and I think a lot of the time we just think of it as like, you know, they probably bury them or they cremate them, but you can do really, really interesting stuff with burial. Death and like what beliefs around death are probably going to be a foundational part in a lot of cultures, because that's kind of a big thing, and it's how we process the grief of losing our loved ones, and so it makes sense that we're going to have practices around death that help us go through that grieving process. I think it can be really interesting to think about how they bury their dead and what the beliefs are around death care, and also this might intersect with beliefs around the afterlife as well. The next one that I think is really interesting to think about, this is also something that I think we can just do more cool stuff with, is like life phases, or like kind of the life cycle and like phases of life. You know, this idea that we have childhood, and then you go to school as a child, and then graduate from childhood, and you start working, and then somewhere in there you have a family, and then eventually when your kids are grown, eventually you retire. It doesn't have to be like that. Your character's kind of life cycle and the phases of life could be completely different in a different culture. There's a culture in my book that have really important practices around falconry. Like, falconry is super important to this culture, and so their life cycles are based around the falcon that they essentially bond with. Coming of age is catching your falcon, And retirement is your falcon dies. I think that that's something interesting that can be played with, and again, it's often just very ingrained that these are stages of life, and often in fantasy, all we do is we just shift stuff younger. But you can do more interesting stuff with phases of life than just making everything happen at a younger age. Number 7 is animals of significance. I'm a big animal lover, and so I just like to think about this. Obviously, pets is like an obvious one, but maybe there's some more interesting stuff with pets. Or are there animals that are of significance, like spiritual significance, whether that's in a deity way or whether it's kind of a we fear this creature way. The ancient Egyptians worshipped cats, which I can tell you my 2 cats have clearly not forgotten about that one. I feel like they bring that one out every single day. They love to bring that up. But maybe your culture has really strong spiritual significance with a completely different animal. Maybe they worship butterflies. Maybe they worship mice. I feel like doing more interesting stuff with the significance of animals in your world rather than just the standard pets and standard animals that we use for farming or going to war. Like, I think there's more stuff that you can do with how the relationships between humans and animals. Number 8 is beliefs around, like, the world structure. So our Earth is round, but we didn't always know that. We used to think it was flat. Some people still do. If your society has not yet discovered that it's a round Earth, what do they think it is? Maybe it's not a round Earth. I mean, it's a fantasy world. It doesn't have to be round Earth. But what do they believe about the world structure? There's a culture in my world who believes that the entire world is a basin. All things will eventually arrive in the center. And they have one city, it's like the capital city of this realm, that they believe is the center of the world's basin. And so to them, there's this idea of, it's like fate, but it's like inevitability. Like, all things are eventually going to arrive here. Eventually, all things of importance, the people that you must meet in your life, the things that must happen to you, it's going to happen there, because that's the basin at the center of the world. Is the world a basin? No. It's a circular planet, but they don't know that. And so if your society does not yet know that it's a round Earth, what do they think it is? I think that can be really interesting, and you can have some really interesting lore and myths surrounding that. The next one that I want to talk about is gender. Now, I think this is like a big one that I'm guessing a lot of people have thought about, especially because I know my audience and I know that a bunch of y'all are queer. Queer people, one thing we do, we think about gender. Maybe you're doing fun things with gender in your world. Like what's the series? I know the first one is the Black Tides of Heaven. Neon Yang's Quartet. There's some really cool gender stuff happening. One of my favorite world-building topics is gender. And this is a place where I think it's really easy to just recycle gender roles and expression that we're familiar with and not even think that there could be another way. Gender in your world can be constructed however you want. I have a culture in my fantasy world that doesn't have gender. They just don't have a concept of gender at all. It just doesn't exist. They don't have a concept of man and woman. There's no designated social rules or expectations of character traits or expression. Like, they just don't have a concept of gender. It just doesn't exist. There's lots of stuff you can do with that. You could have gender roles that are completely different from what we are maybe used to in our own lives, or gender expression, like maybe a world with like the kind of similar concept of binary gender as we have of, constructed similar ideas of men and women, but maybe the idea of what is feminine and what is masculine is completely different. There's no reason why femininity in your world has to be soft and dainty, and masculinity is the opposite to that. Maybe it's completely different. Gender's a construct, and you're constructing your world, so you can construct it to be something totally cool and different. Next up is the calendar, and especially the weekly cycle. Calendar is a pain in the ass. I'm just gonna tell you right now. It's my least favorite thing to deal with. If you have to create a calendar, one thing that I think is a bit easier to manage is the weekly cycle. Why would your fantasy world necessarily have a 5-day week and a weekend? And it could be based on, features of your world that are completely different. If they have unique, geographic or astronomical features, maybe the calendar in the weekly cycle especially is based on something completely different. If they even have weeks, they might not have weeks. The next thing that I think is really fun, countercultures and subcultures. It's easy in fantasy to default to create a very homogenous world, and then when you realize you've created a homogenous world, to break out of that by just creating other cultures in other countries. So you just have a bunch of realms with one culture, and then to break out of that pattern to create multicultural realms themselves by just having different ethnic groups, and so the cultures are always only tied to ethnicity. I think we can think about, you know, creating more diverse pockets of culture in our world by thinking about, you know, cultural movements, countercultures, subcultures. Who are the hippies of your world? Who are the beatniks of your world? Things that are based on social movements, interests, hobbies, lifestyles. I don't feel like I see that enough in fantasy. If that does exist, it's usually only like a religious group or like a revolutionary group, which is cool and interesting, but a lot of Earth subcultures are just based on like people's interests. And I feel like I don't see that as enough. I really want to see who are your fantasy goths. I just really want to know. And the final thing that I think is really fun is fandoms / like fans. This is something that clearly people will do. People will be fans of stuff. They will be fans of media or people that they admire. Why do we never see this in fantasy? You know, maybe there's a bard that's super popular, and maybe this bard has groupies, and people follow this bard around from town to town to see him perform and make fan covers of his songs. I feel like I haven't seen that enough in fantasy. It seems to be such a prevalent part of human nature to be a fan of something. If you've been on the internet, you know how powerful that is. Like, it's a lot. Like, it can be a massive part of people's lives and so many people's lives. So why does that not exist in fantasy? Because it totally could. I have a character in my fantasy book I've just about to start writing who is like a poet bard figure, and she tells like scandalous, sometimes smutty stories about the people in the city, and she has quite the loyal following. She's like a pop icon. So those are 12 world building details that I don't see enough, but that I think are so fun and that there's so much that you can do with. This is obviously not an exhaustive list. There are so many more cool little things that you can think of, but these are just a few that I've been thinking of in my work recently, and I think just help make a world feel more original and expansive, or more like detailed and lived in. What weird little pocket of world building you think isn't talked about enough or isn't paid attention to enough? I think it would be fun to do a follow-up video where I go through all of your guys' suggestions, weird little world building details that people don't often consider, because these are just the ones that I came up with, but I feel like everyone is going to come up with their own stuff. It's going to be super cool. I might pin a comment or leave a Google form or something, and if you want to submit a world building detail, it doesn't have to be like an example from your work, although it could be just something that you feel like a world building detail that people don't consider often enough. You can maybe submit that, and maybe I'll do a follow-up and share all of your guys' submissions. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video. Bye!